Even though it's rogue records that you've read and rumors that you've heard, the kingdom of Banyue certainly exists, Shilian said. Oh yeah? Sanlang hummed. Just then, Nanfeng completed the array on the ground and called out to the others in the room. It's done. When shall we go? Shilian quickly packed a small bag and came to the door. Let's go now. He placed his hand on the door and recited, by the heaven official's blessing, no paths are bound, then gently pushed. When the door was pushed open, there was no longer a small hillside village outside. What replaced it now was a wide city avenue. As wide as the streets were, there was barely anyone on the road, maybe 1 or 2 pedestrians every now and then. This wasn't because it was late in the evening, but because the population in the far northwest was already small, on top of being this close to the Gobi Desert. Even in broad daylight, there wouldn't be many walking about. Shilian closed the door behind him, and it was no longer Puchi Shrine on the inside, but a small inn. This one step certainly was over thousands of miles, the miracle of the distance-shortening array. A couple of pedestrians walked by, staring at them and whispering to themselves, appearing quite guarded. Sanlang spoke up from behind Shilian. According to historical records, when the moon sinks in the sky, follow the North Star, and you will come upon the kingdom of Banyue. Gurga, look. Sanlang pointed to the sky. There's the Polaris. Shilian looked up and smiled. It's so bright. Sanlang stepped closer to stand beside Shilian, took a glance at him, then looked up too. Yeah, it seems the night sky in the northwest is somehow more vast than the Midlands. Shilian agreed, and the two became immersed in a discussion on stars and night skies. Meanwhile, the 2 junior officials behind them watched on in disbelief. Nanfeng questioned, why is he here too? The door you created looked so magical, I followed along to check it out, Sanlang replied innocently. Check it out? Do you think that this is a tour? Nanfeng shouted angrily. Shilian rubbed his forehead and said, let it go. Since he's here, then he's here. He won't eat your rations. I should have enough. Sanlang, stay close to me. Don't get lost. Okay, Sanlang responded, looking obedient and good. This isn't a question of rations, Nanfeng said. Shilian sighed. Nanfeng, please keep it down. It's the middle of the night. Everyone is sleeping. Let's just focus on the task at hand and stop sweating the small stuff. Let's go. The 4 followed the North Star and traveled northward. After walking non-stop for an entire night, the towns and greenery along the way became more and more sparse, and the ground slowly gave way to sand. Finally, they reached the Gobi Desert. Although the distance-shortening array could cross over thousands of miles in one step, it used an exhaustive amount of power. The further one went, the more power it sapped, and the time it took to restore power also lengthened. This one step Nanfeng helped them take would require at least several hours to recover from. To conserve strength in case of unforeseen battle, Shilian decided not to have Fu Yao perform the same conjuring. For a journey such as this, someone must have their powers at full strength. In desert climate, the difference between night and day was extreme. The nights were freezing to the bone, but not too bad. But when it became day, it was another story. The sky was clear and cloudless, giving way to a scorching sun. It was as if they were walking in a steaming oven, cooking them alive from the ground. Shilian led the way, using the direction of the wind and small vegetation growing under boulders to find their path. After a while, he looked back, worried that someone may not be able to keep up. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were obviously fine, seeing that they were immortal. Sanlang, though, made him laugh. Under the blazing sun, the youth had peeled off his outer red tunic and was using it to lazily block off the sun, looking tired and cranky. His skin was pearl white, his hair coal black, and with the red tunic covering his face, his features seemed even more accentuated. Shirlian removed his bamboo hat and put it on Sanlang's head. "Here, I'll lend it to you." Surprised, Sanlang laughed and said, "It's all right," and returned the hat to Shirlian. Shirlian didn't argue. If the boy didn't need it, then there was no need to push. "Let me know if you need it then," Shirlian said. He straightened the hat on his head and continued walking. After a while, the group noticed a small grey building in the midst of all the sand. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be an abandoned inn. Shirlian looked to the sky, seeing that it was just past noon and time for the worst of the heat. They had walked all night, and it was time for a break. Shirlian led the group inside, and they found a table to sit at and settle. From his bag, Shirlian took out a water bottle and handed it to Sanlang. "Do you want some?" Sanlang nodded. He reached for the water bottle and drank from it before Shirlian took it back to drink himself. He gulped down the cool water, his Adam's apple rolling up and down, feeling incredibly refreshed and energized. Next to him, Sanlang had his arm propping up his chin, stealing glances as Shirlian drank. A moment later, he asked, "Is there any more?" Shirlian wiped away the last bit of water that was caught on his moistened lips, then nodded and passed the water bottle over again. Sanlang was about to reach for it when another hand blocked him from the water bottle in Shirlian's grasp. "Hold on," Fu Yao said. He retrieved his own water bottle from his sack and put it on the table, pushing it toward Sanlang. "I have one too." Shirlian immediately knew what he was planning. Knowing Fu Yao's personality, there was no way he would ever share his water bottle. He and Nanfeng were talking about testing Sanlang the night before, so the liquid in the bottle must be unmasking water. If a normal human was to drink a potion such as this, then nothing would happen. However, if they were anything but human, the unmasking water would force its drinker to reveal their true form. Since Nanfeng and Fu Yao wanted to test to see if this youth was a supreme, then the effects of this potion must be considerable. Sanlang smiled. "Gurga and I can share one bottle. It's fine." Fu Yao and Nanfeng eyed Shirlian, and Shirlian thought, "What are you both staring at me for?" Fu Yao said coldly, "His is almost empty. There's no need to be so polite." "Really? Then you two drink first. Don't worry about me," Sanlang said. Those two both fell silent. A moment later, Fu Yao tried again. "You're a guest. You go first." Fu Yao sounded polite and well-mannered, but Shirlian thought that he must have squeezed those words out from between his teeth. Sanlang also made a gesture of welcome. "You two are followers of the host. Please drink first, otherwise it'd be indecent of me." Shirlian watched the three of them play the silly game of false pleasantries and pitied the sad water bottle being roughly pushed around the table. He shook his head. He could feel the poor table tremble from their power play and feared it may not have long to live. Finally, Fu Yao snapped and sneered. "You not accepting this water means that you have a guilty conscience." Sanlang replied with a smile. "You're unfriendly and refused to drink first. Who knows if you've poisoned the water? Maybe you're the ones with a guilty conscience." Fu Yao pointed at Shirlian. "You can very well ask him whether this water is poisoned." "Is this water poisoned, Gurga?" Sanlang turned to Shirlian. It was quite the cunning question. Technically, the unmasking water was a potion that exposed one's true form and didn't harm real people. Shirlian replied slowly, "It's not poisoned, but..." Fu Yao and Nanfeng focused their glare on Sanlang, and he surprisingly let go of his grip on the bottle. "All right." Sanlang grabbed the bottle and shook it playfully in his hand. "If Gurga says that it's okay, then there's no problem." He gulped down the contents of the bottle in one go. Shirlian didn't think he'd be so straightforward, and was quite shocked. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were stunned too, and tensed immediately. Yet who knew After San Lang drank all of that unmasking water, he shook the bottle again, then threw it over his shoulder, where it crashed and shattered. "Tastes bad," he said. Shock flashed across Fu Yao's face when he saw that the unmasking water did nothing to San Lang. A moment later, he said impassively, "It's only water. What difference is there?" San Lang reached for the water bottle next to Shirlian's elbow and replied, "Of course it's different. This one tastes much better." Shirlian chuckled. San Lang really didn't care for any challenges going his way, nor did he care about his true identity. So other than entertainment, this fight was meaningless. Shirlian thought that this would be the end of it, but Nanfeng stood up and dropped the sword onto the table with a loud clang. With such a strong battle aura surrounding him, at first Shirlian thought that Nanfeng intended to end San Lang for good and was speechless for a moment. "What are you doing?" Shirlian asked. "The road ahead is dangerous," Nanfeng stated in a low voice. "This is a gift for the little buddy, for self-defense." The sheath of the sword was ancient in design and bore wear and tear from the ages. It was no ordinary sword. Shirlian's eyes widened in recognition. He put his hand on his forehead and turned away. He muttered to himself, "It's Hong Jing." The name of the sword was indeed Hong Jing. This sword was a sacred sword. While it could not fight evil, no evil could escape its spiritual mirror. Should any non-human entities pull it from its sheath, then the blade would turn red as if covered in blood, and the crimson blade would reflect the true form of that which unsheathed it. Whether you were a savage or a supreme, none shall escape. There were no young men who would not be interested in swords or horses, so San Lang appeared rather excited. "Ooh, let me see," he said. Sheath in one hand, hilt in the other, San Lang pulled at the sword. Nanfeng and Fu Yao stared intently, but when merely 3 inches of the sword was pulled out, San Lang laughed. "Gurgur, are your servants playing a joke on me?" he asked. Shirlian cleared his throat and turned back around. "San Lang, I already said that they are not servants." He then turned around again. "Who's joking around with you?" Nanfeng said coldly. "How can one self-defend with a broken sword?" San Lang sheathed the sword and threw it back onto the table. Nanfeng's face froze for a moment. Then he immediately picked up the sword to check. He pulled it out of the sheath and heard a clunk, and suddenly, in his hand, was now a sharp and chilling, broken sword. Hong Jing was broken from 3 inches down. Nanfeng's face changed colors, and he turned the sheath upside down. There was a clattering sound of a mess of clinks and clanks. What was left of the blade within the sheath was now broken into bright and sharp little fragments. The Hong Jing sword was a powerful weapon that could expose its enemies, but Nanfeng had never heard of any technique that could break it from within the sheath. Nanfeng and Fu Yao both pointed at San Lang and cried, "You!" San Lang snickered and threw himself back into his chair. He pushed back and put his feet up on the table, then tossed one of the broken pieces in his hand in the air to play. "I'm sure you guys didn't do this on purpose and just weren't careful enough with it on the road. Don't worry about me. I don't need some broken sword as protection. Keep it for yourselves." As for Shirlian, he simply couldn't look at Hong Jing directly. The sacred sword used to be part of the collection of Jun Wu, the martial heavenly emperor. During his first ascension, Shirlian once visited Jun Wu's palace and thought, despite its lack of combat power, Hong Jing was an interesting sword, so Jun Wu had gifted it to him. After the first banishment, there was a time when things had gotten really difficult, and Shirlian gave the sword to Feng Shen to be pawned. That's right, pawned. Money made from pawning Hong Jing was enough to fill their stomachs for a number of meals. Shirlian had pawned off too many treasures during that time, and he had forced himself to forget every single one of them, lest his heart bleed with regret. Feng Shen remembered the sword after his ascension, and couldn't bear having a sacred sword lost amongst mortals, so he found it again. It was sharpened, cleaned, and hung in the palace of Nanyang, and now it was brought down by Nanfeng. In any case, whenever Shilian saw that sword, he'd feel a dull pain and could only look away. He could sense that the other three were about to start bickering again and shook his head, instead carefully observing the weather outside. The wind was picking up, Shilian noted. There might be a sandstorm later on. Should they continue on? Would they be able to find shelter? Just then, over the golden sand, two shadows suddenly flashed by. Shilian straightened up immediately. Two silhouettes, one black and one white, strolled unhurriedly but rapidly, as if they were gliding through the clouds. The one dressed in black was slender and elegant. The one in white, on the other hand, was a female cultivator, a sword on her back and a whisk in hand. As they sped by the abandoned inn, the black figure never looked back once, but the white figure glanced over and smiled in the flash of a moment. It was forebodingly creepy. It was only because Shilian had been keeping an eye on the outside that he caught that scene, but the other three probably only saw their retreating backs. Nanfeng stopped his bickering instantly and rose. Who was that? I don't know, but they're not ordinary people, Shilian replied, and stood up too. The wind is picking up. Stop playing around and let's go as far as we can. Although the bickering trio constantly argued, they had nevertheless steeled their hearts to do what they came out to do. So they immediately cleaned up the pieces of Hongjing before heading out the door. The four of them continued their trek, now against a blowing headwind. They walked for another 4 hours, wind howling in their ears, but the leeway they made was incomparable to the same distance that they were able to cover earlier in the day. The whipping gusts grew stronger, throwing sand in their faces and bodies, beating at any uncovered skin. The more they advanced, the more difficult it became. Gusts became deafening gales, and whirling sand wrapped the air around them, blinding their path. Shilian, holding his bamboo hat down, called out, "The sandstorm doesn't feel right." No one answered him, and Shilian looked back, afraid that someone might be lost. But all three were present and following him. It's just that no one had heard him. The gales were so strong, his voice was swallowed up. He wasn't particularly worried about Nanfeng and Fu Yao. Even with the crazed winds whipping, the two walked steadily, full of killing intent. Sun Lung, on the other hand, followed closely behind Shilian, never more than 5 steps away. Even with so much sand blowing and thrashing about, Sun Lung remained calm and collected, his arms folded behind him as he walked. His red tunic and black hair danced wildly in the wind, as if he hadn't any care in the world. Shilian could feel how hard the sand was hitting his face, and was worried by how little Sun Lung seemed to mind. He opened his mouth to tell the youth to watch out for sand getting in his eyes and sleeves, but figured that he wouldn't be able to hear him, so Shilian reached over directly to help fold in his sleeves, patting down to make sure that no sand would get in. Sun Lung was taken aback by the sudden gesture. The other two behind them approached, and with everyone close and within better hearing range, Shilian tried talking again. "Be careful, everyone. This wind came out of nowhere. It's not right. There may be evil blown into this." "It's just a little sandstorm. How evil can it be?" Fu Yao asked. Shilian shook his head. "The wind is all right. There may be more sand in the gusts, though." Just then, a powerful gust whipped by, blowing off Shilian's bamboo hat. If it flew off, it would disappear in the desert forever. But Sun Lung reacted immediately and grabbed the hat in time with an abnormally fast hand. He returned the bamboo hat to Shilian once more, and Shilian thanked him. Shilian retied the hat onto his head before saying, "We should probably find shelter for the time being." Fu Yao disagreed. "If there's evil in the storm trying to stop us from advancing, Then we must continue." Before Shirlian could say anything, San Lang burst out laughing. Fu Yao raised his head and asked coldly, "What are you laughing at?" San Lang folded his arms and chuckled. "Does being subversive give you the satisfaction of feeling unique and independent?" Shirlian had always thought that it was hard to tell when San Lang's laughs were sincere, but this time there was definitely not a single trace of sincerity. Fu Yao's eyes grew dark, and Shirlian raised his hand to stop another impending argument. "Stop right there, you two. If you've got things to say, you can say them later. It wouldn't be funny if the wind blows stronger." "What, think it'll blow you away?" Fu Yao mocked. "That may very well help." Shirlian didn't even finish his sentence before the three in front of him suddenly vanished. Actually, they weren't the ones who vanished, but rather he did. Another powerful gust had carried him away for real, a twister. Shirlian spun madly in the sky. He threw out his arm and cried, "Ruya, grab hold of something dependably solid." Ruya shot out from within Shirlian's sleeve, and in the next moment he could feel the other end of the white bandage sink, as if it was tied onto something, and it yanked him to a stop. After finally stabilizing himself in the crazed wind, Shirlian realized that he had been blown over 10 feet above ground. Shirlian was now like a kite, attached to the ground by only a single thread. With sand whipping at his face, Shirlian held fast and tried to see exactly what Ruya had tied itself to. Squinting and blinking, Shirlian finally recognized a red silhouette. The other end of Ruya seemed to be wrapped around the wrist of the youth in red. Shirlian had told Ruya to grab hold of something dependably solid, and it had grabbed onto San Lang.